Welcome back to the SFU Colloquium on medical cannabis. Those of you that are watching it live, welcome as well. You've probably seen this slide quite a few times, those of you that are regularly been attending these shows. The sad news is that this is the last one in the series. Yeah, I know. There's hope, and the hope is that perhaps we'll continue the series next year or the year after. I know there's a huge amount of interest, and certainly I would like to see more discussion and more education on medical cannabis and potentially recreational cannabis as well. So it's not over. When you think about medical cannabis, think of SFU and vice versa. Okay, so those of you that have been involved with the whole series, you know that we are at the end, and Dr. Kilmer is going to be up here in a few minutes talking about the legalization aspects of cannabis, and we've had a good slate of speakers over the last, believe it or not, 3 months. So we are pretty much close to the end here for this. As I said, the lecture today will be by Dr. Kilmer, and I do want to remind you that we have a reception, as we always do, after the talk. But in addition, we have poster sessions by the students that have been working very hard in this course, and they're eager to talk about their findings in the posters. And I'll be showing you the titles of some of those posters, so that what you basically need to do is come out this door, hang a left, and go into the large rooms that are by the windows there, grab a drink or something to eat, and start talking to the students about the posters. And we'll be here till about 10:30, or as long as you want to stay. So please feel free to do that. Those of you that are watching this live, we are actually going to videotape the posters, and so you'll be able to see that next week on the SFU website. So what are the students going to be talking about on their posters? There's a huge range of topics, as you see here. Marijuana mutinies, the revolutionary role of cannabis, the need for cannabis education for young people, problems with roadside testing for cannabis, should you be driving, Mary Jane? Applications of tissue culture for cannabis cultivation. Does cannabis help with sleep disorders? Impacts of legalizing recreational marijuana. Cannabis extraction methods, comparisons and considerations. Cannabis and pesticides. Is cannabis addictive? And cannabis and neurodegenerative disorders, as well as a number of others. So you can see this is truly an educational opportunity for those of you that will come to the posters and talk to the students about the research that they've done on all these various topics. And I can't begin to tell you which are the ones that interest me the most. They all do. So please feel free to come by and view these in the room over to the left here. So we do have a website, as many of you know, www.sfu.ca, medical marijuana, and all of the public lectures from all the speakers that I mentioned earlier, all 6 of them are going to be or have been posted on the site, so you can always go back as a reference and watch them again. And of course, this one is being live streamed for those of you that are at home. So we have, again, the pleasure of acknowledging many of our sponsors, including the President's Office, the postgraduate studies and postdoctoral fellows, and the Faculty of Science. President Andrew Petter was supposed to be here, but he got called away on an urgent meeting. So unfortunately, he does send his regards and wishes you all the best. And I know he shares in the success of this particular colloquium. And certainly it was funded through the President's Office, as well as all of the sponsors that are listed here. NSERC, Agrima, Afria, Aurora, Tweed, Lift Cannabis, Kwantlen Polytech University, Zenabis, and Soma Labs. And our major sponsor today is Agrima Botanicals that have sponsored the reception. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Neil Boyd, who's a professor in the School of Criminology, to introduce our speaker today. And Neil's part of the organizing committee, as are various members that are present here today in the audience. Thanks, Neil.
Thanks, Amir. I think the first time that I heard Beau Kilmer speak was at a meeting of the International Society for the Study of Drug Policy in Belgium. And I was particularly impressed by his energy level, by the framework that he used in terms of the analysis that he presented. And it didn't take long for us to come up with Beau as a potential speaker on the subject of legalization. He's published widely in a range of some of the best journals in medicine, in social science, and he has been working for RAND as the co-director of their drug policy unit. I'm sure you're going to learn a lot that you didn't know, and be given a very stimulating lecture. Beau.
All right, well, good evening. And I want to begin by thanking Neil and Samir and Martin Bouchard and everyone at Simon Fraser for kind of giving me the opportunity to be here. It's really nice to be back in Vancouver. And I want to thank all of you for taking some time out of your evening to come chat about cannabis policy. As Neil mentioned, I work at the RAND Corporation. We're headquartered right outside of Los Angeles. And we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization, which is really dedicated to improving policy and decision-making through research and analysis. So I've got more than 1,000 colleagues working on a variety of issues, ranging from the environment to education, national defense. And as Neil mentioned, I co-direct our Drug Policy Research Center, which is kind of at the nexus of the work that we do on health as well as criminal justice. I want to make it very clear that RAND doesn't have an official position on marijuana, and we don't take positions on bills or initiatives. But what I wanted to do tonight, 3 different things before we kind of open this up for Q&A. First of all, I wanted to bring you up to speed on kind of what's happening with marijuana legalization, not only in the United States, but also in other places. I then want to talk about some of the design issues. That is, how this ends up playing out, whether it ends up being good for society or bad for society, is going to depend on a number of implementation issues. And today I want to talk about 10 of them, which all conveniently begin with the letter P. But then finally, I want to kind of bring you up to speed on the emerging literature and about the research that's happening in the states with respect to legalization. There's not a lot out there, but we can start to talk about how things are beginning to play out in these jurisdictions that have legalized. And this is based on a number of collaborations. This isn't just work that I've done alone, it's work that's led to different books and articles and reports, but it hasn't just been academic. A lot of these insights are based on my work with folks that are trying to implement this. So for example, when Washington State legalized, they needed to figure out, well, how big is the market, or how big is the marijuana market, so then they can make decisions about the number of stores to allow, make accurate projections about tax revenues. So I did that work to help them figure out that estimate. I spent time down in Uruguay before they legalized and was there afterwards helping them think about how they could evaluate the changes that they're making down there. And I also spent some time working with the state of Vermont, not telling the state you should legalize or you should not legalize, but really helping them think through a lot of these issues that you're going to confront if you're going to go down this path toward doing something other than prohibiting marijuana supply. And I'm going to share some of those insights with you tonight. But let's step back and let's ask, well, why is this controversial? I mean, there are a number of arguments that are made on both sides of the debate, and these are just a couple of them. On the pro side, a lot of people are sick of having the money go toward the illicit market, and they'd rather bring that money back in and actually have some of those revenues come back into public programs. Some advocates for legalization also talk about the criminal justice aspects, not only in terms of how much money the criminal justice system spends enforcing marijuana prohibition, but also with respect to what it means in terms of a criminal record. And I'm not sure what the exact situation is here in Canada, but obviously in the States, if you have a criminal record, there's a number of problems, a number of issues you run into. But then we have this whole host of other collateral consequences that are just specific to drug offenses. If you're convicted of a drug offense, it can be harder to get financial aid to go to college. It can also, depending on where you are in the country, it can be harder to get into public housing. It can even have implications for whether or not you want to adopt a kid. So there are big implications here. Another argument is about product testing, that if you legalize, we're going to be able to try to reduce the amount of mold and pesticides, and also make sure that the customers know, or the consumers know, what they're actually consuming. There are also arguments that it will be easier to use and study for medicinal purposes. As I said, there are a number of other arguments, but those are just some that you'll commonly hear in these debates. On the anti-legalization side, there's a lot of concern about public health, and there's worries that folks are going to, that because of legalization, it's going to increase the number of youth who consume, and then it also may increase the number of people who experience cannabis use disorders. There are concerns about there being more impaired driving, increases to emergency room visits, and it also turns out that heavy marijuana use during adolescence ends up being correlated with a lot of bad outcomes. For example, high school dropout. Of course, it's really hard to try to tease out whether or not that was a causal effect. Did marijuana cause that outcome or something else? So that's actually where a lot of the debate is about whether or not these studies really are proving a causal relationship. And also kind of on the anti side, there's concerns about a lot of these new products. I mean, most of the research that we talk about with respect to marijuana, whether it be the health benefits or the health costs, a lot of that comes from people that were smoking relatively low potency product. Things are a lot different now. But, as I said before, what's happening in the United States really is unprecedented. In November of 2012, the voters in Colorado not only voted to get rid of marijuana prohibition, they also voted to allow for-profit companies to come in and begin producing. And, not even the Netherlands goes this far. Yes, if you're in Amsterdam, you can walk into one of those coffee shops and buy up to 5 grams because they have an official policy of not enforcing the law against small-scale transactions. And kind of think about it being legal in the front door. However, they're still prohibited from producing and selling marijuana to those coffee shops. So it's actually illegal in the back door, and you still have a large black market there. So if you're trying to make projections about what legalization is going to, how legalization is going to play out, you can't just necessarily look to the Netherlands because what's happening in Colorado and Washington and other places is a lot different with the for-profit companies coming in. And it was in November of 2014 that the voters in Alaska and Oregon also voted to remove the prohibition on marijuana and allow for-profit companies to come in and produce. But what gets less attention is that in that same election, the voters in Washington, D.C. also voted to legalize, but they have a different system. There, if you're an adult, you can grow at home, you can possess up to a couple ounces maybe, and you can give it away. But they don't have retail shops. So this is an example of one of these things I'm going to talk about in a few moments, of these middle ground options. That is, if you're a jurisdiction and thinking about doing something other than prohibition, you have a lot of options out there. They don't get discussed much, and I'm going to try to rectify that. And then there's Vermont. So for those 4 states in Washington, D.C., this has all happened through the ballot initiative process. Well, there were a lot of people thought that Vermont might be the first state to actually pass this through the normal legislative process, having a bill signed by the House and the Senate, passed by the House and Senate, and actually signed by the governor. There was a bill was introduced in January of 2016, or maybe late 2015. It passed their Senate in 2016, so everyone thought this was going to happen, that legalization was going to happen in Vermont. Well, then that bill had to go to their House, and it was destroyed. I forget the specifics, but it lost, I think it was 121 to 28. And I think this caught a lot of people off guard. And so the Associated Press went and interviewed some of these representatives and said, well, why did you vote the way you did? And for some of these individuals, it wasn't because they were opposed to marijuana legalization and removing prohibition. They voted against it because they didn't want commercialization. Because as you know, Vermont, when we did some work for Vermont, it turns out if you go about 50 miles outside of the borders of Vermont, you get 5 times the market that you get just being in the state. If you go 200 miles outside the borders, you have about 40 times the size of the market. So what Vermont had to make decisions about was how much of that outside market they wanted to supply. And there were some real concerns about commercialization. That said, last I heard, they're still having discussions about legalization now, but it's more along the lines of the Washington, D.C. model, where you'd be able to grow at home and give it away, but not necessarily have retail stores. And then, as most of you know, in November of 2016, 4 more states passed legalization, including California. So as of right now, more than 20% of the U.S. population lives in states that have passed initiatives to create these for-profit models. But, this is all still illegal under federal law. And it was, and after those initiatives passed in Colorado and Washington in 2012, no one was quite sure what the federal government was going to do. And it wasn't until August of 2013 that the Department of Justice released a memo indicating that for the time being, they weren't going to block implementation efforts as long as the states had strong enforcement and regulatory systems. That memo made it very clear that, hey, the federal government's not legalizing cannabis, and if you're a federal prosecutor and you want to go for a trafficking case, here are some of your priorities. If they're selling to youth, serving as a front for organized crime. But realize what this did. This not only sent a signal to Washington and Colorado, this sent a signal to other states and to other countries that for the time being, the Obama administration was willing to tolerate for-profit companies to come in and produce a federally prohibited drug as long as they play by their rules. And I think this really ended up opening up a lot of conversations outside of the United States about alternatives to prohibition, not just about cannabis. But of course, we have a new administration now. And I have to say, it's not clear what they're going to do. They've got a number of options. Obviously, one thing they could do is they could try to crack down, since this is all illegal under federal law. But there are a few things you have to kind of keep in mind. Even before legalization, the federal government wasn't going after people for possession. I mean, they might pick somebody up if they were smoking in Yosemite or on one of the federal parks. But when the federal government focused on marijuana cases, it was usually for large-scale traffickers. And the other thing to keep in mind is there are only about 4,000 or 5,000 DEA agents. So it would be, and they're kind of busy right now dealing with everything with fentanyl and the opioid issues. And so the idea of kind of sending in the DEA to kind of shut some of this down, it's a possibility, but it doesn't. I mean, to me, it doesn't necessarily seem very likely. A lot's going to depend though on the U.S. attorneys. And that's it. So Jeff Sessions is still in the process of picking those U.S. attorneys, and they're going to have a fair amount of discretion. But even if they didn't send in the DEA, there's still a lot that the federal government could do to wreak havoc on the industry. You could just send out cease and desist letters. That's a 29-cent stamp. Or actually, no, it's not. It's actually more than 29 cents now. But you could just send a cease and desist letters to landlords saying, if you're going to rent to those who are in the marijuana industry, we're going to seize your property. That wouldn't cost very much, and you wouldn't have to crack down in a number of places in order for that to potentially have an effect. So there is possible, but on the other hand, you have to keep in mind there would be political repercussions if they were to do this. Marijuana is very popular in the United States, and for example, in Colorado, when they wrote the initiative, they designated some of the tax revenue to go toward school construction. So you can imagine the PR issues if they tried to shut things down in Colorado. Then for them saying by doing that you're actually cutting off revenue to school construction. So it's possible that they could create difficulties for the industry, but you have to realize there would be political repercussions for that. Another option is that you could keep it illegal at the federal level, but they could just shape the market. They could say, hey, look, this is still all illegal, and we could shut you down if we wanted to, but here's what we're going to do. If you advertise or if you're selling some of these high-potency products, we're going to go after you. So, or pick whatever regulation or whatever goal you want. But there are things that the federal government or some of these U.S. attorneys could do to shape what the market looks like, especially in places where you see a large increase in advertising. Third option is that the federal government could do nothing, just kind of continue with the approach of the Obama administration. Fourth option, and these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, would be to reschedule marijuana. Right now it's Schedule 1 in our Controlled Substances Act. This gets a lot of attention, especially on the advocacy side. And I think if this were to happen, it would largely, the effects would largely be symbolic. That said, if you move marijuana away from Schedule 1, it would make it easier to do research on it. I mean, you can do research on marijuana now, but because it's Schedule 1, there are a lot of extra hoops you have to jump through. So rescheduling could do a lot in terms of making it easier to do research, but in terms of affecting the non-medical market, I think it does. I think that approach actually gets overplayed a bit. A fifth approach is that you could still keep it illegal under federal law, but then the federal government could try to resolve some of these issues. For example, banking. In the states, because of the federal prohibition, states are actually banks will be engaging in money laundering if they take the money from some of the marijuana businesses, and so that's why a lot of this is a big cash industry. So one of the things they could do is still keep it illegal, but try to make that work. Another option is they could keep it illegal under federal law, but kind of create a waiver system, saying, okay, if you're a state and you want to legalize, here's the deal. If you make sure that it's not, the cannabis that's being produced isn't being exported, and you take, and you follow X, Y, and Z, the federal government won't intervene. So that's a potential option too, and that could actually open up some other supply regimes. And finally, the option is, the final option is they could just legalize it. It would be, like I said, you need to be skeptical of anyone who claims that they know what the administration is going to do about marijuana. But if this happens, it actually would be really interesting to see kind of what happens in terms of, reactions about our, obligations to the United Nations conventions. And that's even something interesting here we talked about earlier with Canada, and that if Canada legalizes cannabis, what's Canada's reactions going to be about the UN conventions? What are they going to do? Not only is that going to be interesting in and of itself, what do they do or do not do, but it'll also be really interesting to see how the United States does or does not react to Canada. And I think that reaction or non-reaction could have implications for cannabis policy discussions and actually other drug policy discussions in other parts of the world. So it's going to be fascinating to kind of see how this all plays out. But as I referenced before, this isn't just a U.S. phenomenon. In December of 2013, Uruguay became the first country to legalize. And the supply regimes are very different. If you're 18 or older and you want to get access to legal marijuana, you have to register with the government and you have to choose one of 3 different mechanisms. You can either grow it at home, join a cannabis buyers club or a collective, which they limit right now at 45 members, or eventually you're going to be able to purchase it from pharmacies. And so there's a lot of state regulation. I think they're only going to allow flower. They're banning advertising. And I just saw something actually earlier today suggesting that you might actually be able to purchase it so this is only for residents. Non-residents aren't going to be able to come in, but that the residents who register with the government, I think it looks like it might be sometime in the summer. But this keeps kind of getting pushed back. But they've definitely been taking their time there. But it's a very different model from what we see in the U.S. And then there's Jamaica. So Jamaica passes this law in 2015, which on the books seems like it's kind of very much focused on medical marijuana. But once you kind of dig into it, it has the potential to be very aggressively commercial. And then, I've heard, I think they're still working out the details, but at one point they were talking about how visitors from outside of Jamaica would be able to come in and I think pay some fee and say that they have a recommendation from their country, and then they would get access to purchase. There's a lot of discussion there about this being a tool for economic development and also discussions for export. It's very interesting. This idea of the revenue and economic development, that wasn't part of the discussion at all in Uruguay. And I can tell you when I was down there and kind of talking about some of this, once we started talking about taxes, and they said, hey, we're not focused on that. There they kind of saw it more as a human rights issue. But as I said, there are a lot of how this ends up playing out is going to depend on these implementation issues. And the first one I want to talk about is production. Now, there are a number of reasons why we would expect that after legalization, the production and distribution costs are going to go down quite a bit. Most obviously, you're getting rid of the risk. Right now, when someone purchases marijuana or heroin or cocaine, a lot of what they're doing is compensating the drug dealers and everyone else along that supply chain for their risk of arrest and risk of incarceration. Legalized, that goes away. You also, changes in the scale of production, if you allow big industrial grows, changes in technology, if you allow competition. So there are a number of reasons why kind of in theory we would expect it to push down those costs. And just to kind of give you an example, right now in Northern California around Humboldt, depending on the time of year, it might cost you, from a grower about $1,500, give or take, to get a pound of kind of high potency sinsemilla. We did some work trying to figure out, so California, they passed in 2016, but they also voted on legalization in 2010 and it didn't pass. But when they were having those discussions around 2009, 2010, we did some work trying to project, what would happen in California? And at that point, we had no idea what the federal government was going to do. So we started kind of building this cost model saying, okay, let's imagine a scenario where the federal government would only permit California to legalize if they only had indoor grows. So if that was the situation, what would that mean in terms of the costs for producing a pound of high-potency sinsemilla? And our best estimates were that could actually be in the low hundreds of dollars to produce that same pound. Now, this is pre-tax, let me tell you. But after talking to those who are actually growing in greenhouses as well as others that are growing other products besides cannabis, our best estimates was that could be, for that same pound of sinsemilla, could be in the low hundreds of dollars. Then we tried figuring out, what if you actually allowed big industrial grows, let's say it was legalized at the federal level, and you wanted to extract out as much THC as you would get from that kind of pound of sinsemilla, and the best calculations suggest that could be well below $100. And so that's the thing to kind of keep in mind is that these production and distribution costs can go down quite a bit. Now, I know some of you are thinking, we can just tax it, we can do some other things if we want to kind of keep those prices up. And we'll get to that in a moment. But this is a decision you have. You can decide, do you want to allow outdoor grows, indoor grows? Do you want to limit production? Remember, when Washington State legalized, they initially set a cap on the total amount produced, trying to kind of control the market. Colorado didn't do that. So this is a choice you have. If you're going to go down this path, you're going to have to make some tough decisions about production. And I think the most important one is, are you going to try to cap cap the production, or are you going to try to just allow the market to drive what happens? This gets to my next point. The next decision you have to make is about profit motive. If you're going to go down this path, you have to decide, do you want to allow for-profit companies to get involved? You don't necessarily have to, but that's where a lot of the debate is, especially in the United States. And so it's there's a large focus on we either prohibit and kind of reduce some of the sanctions, or let's regulate marijuana like alcohol. And you see this on a lot of the ballot initiatives, I think partially because voters are familiar with it. They understand the alcohol model. But there are a couple things you have to keep in mind if you are going to allow for-profit companies to get involved. First of all, the 80-20 rule is in effect. It's 20% of the marijuana users that account for 80% of consumption. These are your daily and your near-daily users. It's the same thing for alcohol. So if you're going to allow for-profit companies to get involved, this is who they're going to target. They're going to try to nurture and create more heavy users to actually make profits. And the other thing, and this is we're especially sensitive to this in the States, is that you're going to create you have the potential of creating this large lobby that may, over time, fight against regulation and fight against taxation. So this is one of the things you have to keep in mind. And as I said, there are other options. And so when we, and let me be very clear, there are pros and cons with all of these options, not just with a for-profit approach. But as I said, I ended up doing some work for the state of Vermont, trying to help them think through some of these issues. And so we essentially wrote kind of a book that had a focus on a lot of these different alternatives. And so we highlighted 12 different alternatives to status quo prohibition. And I just want to run through a few of them here. Obviously, as I said, these are the ones that get commonly discussed in the United States. It sounds like the conversation that's been happening here in Canada, as well as when folks are talking about this in Europe, there's much more kind of a focus on public health and maybe less of a focus on the commercial approach. But as I said, there are other options out there. For example, if you wanted to do something other than prohibit marijuana supply, we kind of consider there's some small scale options. You could do what Washington, D.C. is doing, just allow home production. You could create these cannabis buyers clubs, kind of what you have in Uruguay, what you have in Spain. There are a few in Belgium, and there are a couple others popping up around different parts of Europe. You could potentially allow the Dutch system, where you're allowing the retail sales, but not necessarily allowing the production, kind of where you'd be in a very gray legal area. Now, these options, they could reduce, they could potentially reduce the size of the black market. But for some folks say, hey, look, but if you were to do this approach, it might be harder to actually regulate and test the substance. But you could develop, that could be true. You could develop testing and regulation. But one of the bigger criticisms of these kind of small scale options is that they're not going to bring in money. And especially in the States, there's a lot of focus on trying to bring in tax revenue, to the local and to the state governments. But if that's what you want to do, if your goal is to bring in money to the state, you still have other options besides just allowing for-profit companies to do this. For example, you could have a state monopoly where the state actually it controls the production, does the distribution. You could do create some type of nonprofit model where you could limit participation in the market to nonprofit organizations that may have a focus on public health or children's issues. You could even if you are going to allow for-profit companies to get involved, you could limit it to those that have social and environmental missions. For example, those that focus on the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profits. So you have a lot of options there. And I want to make it very clear, we don't have time to get into all this right now, but there are pros and cons with all of these different options too. And one of the things you do worry about is, especially if you have the state production model and the state becomes addicted to these tax revenues coming in, that could have real implications down the line for what ends up happening to consumption. Now, as I said, there are multiple options within this middle ground. For some jurisdictions, that's going to be a destination. For others, they might start with one of these middle ground options, and then they might move to something else, maybe move closer toward the for-profit model. The thing to keep in mind is they're not mutually exclusive. For example, at the wholesale level, you could have a state monopoly, and then maybe at the retail level, you have cooperatives, or you can limit it to nonprofits. So there's a lot of potential for mixing and matches here. And I think this is going to be important, not only for kind of what ends up potentially playing out here in Canada, but especially in California too. The state's in the process of trying to create the regulatory structure. But the Prop 64, which passed in November of 2016, it gives the local jurisdictions a lot of discretions. They're going to be able to make choices about whether or not to allow production in the area, allow retail shops. And what's going to be different about California compared to Colorado and Washington is that they're going to allow for on-site consumption. So you're going to have marijuana, in some places you're going to have marijuana lounges. So you walk down the street, this is where you get your gin and tonic, this is where you get your wine. There's going to be another place over here, and that's where you're going to be able to consume cannabis products. Now, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out with respect to indoor air laws and whether or not they have open backyards. And I think you're going to see a lot of local variation there. And it just kind of hits home. There are a lot of options for jurisdictions that are considering these alternatives. Related to this, the third P I want to talk about is promotion. You have to decide, are you going to allow promotion? Are you going to allow billboards? I mean, that's one of the things that they've noticed in Oregon. I mean, I haven't seen any quantitative evidence of this, but there's a lot of discussion that promotion really has picked up in Oregon, especially compared to Washington. You got billboards, people with sandwich signs. You have to decide, do you want to try to regulate this? And as I said before, in Uruguay, they've banned it. They're not allowing advertising. And in each of these states that in the U.S., I mean, they've tried to put restrictions on this, but because of our commercial free speech doctrine, it makes it very difficult to actually go out and ban the advertising. So this is something you're going to have to decide. Are you going to allow it? And to the extent you're going to allow it, are you going to allow billboards? And are you going to be able to do this on TV? There are a lot of decisions, and that can really influence kind of what ends up happening to. I think, in theory, that could have big implications for what ends up happening to consumption. Fourth P is prevention. If you're going to go down this path, there are three questions you have. One, are you going to put more money into prevention? Two, how are you going to change your messaging? And three, if you're going to do that, when do you want it to go into effect? Because you often hear people say, you know what, we're going to legalize marijuana, we're going to tax the hell out of it, and then we're going to be able to put all of this money into prevention and treatment, which could be true. But early on, there are a lot of costs there, and so you have to decide on day one when the store is open, do you want to have those prevention campaigns? Not just necessarily focus on consumption, but also focus on impaired driving. Do you want to have those already focus grouped and ready to go when the store is open? Or because if you're only relying on those tax revenues, there could be some lag there. And I think a lot of these jurisdictions are still trying to figure out, well, what's the appropriate type of prevention messaging to be doing? But in a lot of these places, as it is here in Vancouver, a lot of these places already had vibrant medical markets before legalization. But when we think about prevention, it also includes limiting access or exposure to marijuana. And this is actually where I think there's a lot to learn from all the research that's been done on regulating alcohol and tobacco products in terms of number of retail off-premise stores, days of operation, hours of operation. I think there's a lot that we can't just automatically look to the tobacco and alcohol models for all of the question or for all of the answers. But at least with respect to thinking about preventing access, I think there is a fair amount that can be learned. The fifth P is policing and enforcement. You're going to have to decide, if you're going to do this, how much money are you going to put into policing and enforcing the laws that are still going to be on the books for marijuana. And the thing to keep in mind is, if you look at, it depends on what the age range, it sounds like the discussion in Canada is around 18 versus 19, but at least in the US, about 20 to 25% of the market is attributable to those who are under 21. So you're still going to be running into these issues about what are you going to do with those who, for youth who get caught in possession. Also, are you going to spend more resources trying to deal with smoking in public? And then also, what are you going to continue to do about, or what's going to be done about the illicit market transactions? And this is especially a big deal in California, because in California, even after legalization, they still expect that, at least in the short run, there are going to be a lot of producers, especially up in Northern California, that are still going to be producing. And so the question is, are the regulators and law enforcement, are they going to try to shut down these unlicensed growers? Because if that's the case, that would take a lot of resources. And so I don't know how that's going to play out. I mean, you can imagine up there, some people kind of playing by the book that actually have, they're paying the fees, they're being regulated. I wonder if they're going to tolerate those that are producing, that are kind of doing this all under the table. So it'll be fascinating to see how that unfolds. But kind of related to this, the sixth P is you have to make decisions about penalties. For minors in possession, what's going to be the penalty? Is it going to be the same thing that it is for alcohol? And I would say, if that's your answer, I'd say, well, are we doing the right thing for alcohol with respect to MIPs? I mean, that's an empirical question. Will the penalties for impaired driving change? And also, and this is a big one, for production. If someone overproduces and then kind of works its way outside of the illicit market, what's the punishment going to be? Is it just going to be a fine, or is it going to be a criminal offense? Because if it's just going to be a fine, you can imagine a lot of people will consider it just a cost of doing business and overproduce. But if you're going to really enforce this, then you need to think about what the penalty is going to be, and then getting back to that fifth P, you need to decide how many, what type of resources are you going to devote to this. I mean, definitely legalization is not going to, early on, it's not going to eliminate criminal justice costs whatsoever. We would think that over time it's going to reduce them, and we're seeing that in terms of reduction in possession arrests, but there's still a lot that could potentially go on, especially depending on what you're doing and what the goal is for getting rid of the illicit market and how quickly you want to do that. The seventh P is potency. One of the decisions you're going to have to make is whether or not you want to put controls on this. There are dozens of cannabinoids in the cannabis plant. THC is the one that gets the most attention. This is what's responsible for largely responsible for intoxication. For some people, it can increase the probability of a panic attack. Some people can increase the probability of experiencing a psychotic symptom. And just a lot of variation. And so it's hard to figure this out, but we did some work about, it was looking around 2007, 2008. We're trying to figure out, well, of all the marijuana that was consumed in the States, how much is coming from Mexico? And it was tough, but our best estimates were at that time, it was between 40 to 67%. And my guess is that that's kind of gone down. But the THC for the stuff that was coming from Mexico was roughly between 4 to 8% THC. Now, as you know, you walk into any of the shops here in Colorado or in Washington or in even California, you can see that the THC levels can range anywhere from 10 to 25%, and sometimes we can even say higher. There have been so as I said, one of the decisions you have to make is, do you want to cap that? And in both Colorado and the Netherlands, there's been discussions about capping the flower at 15%. It's not entirely clear to me how they came up with that figure, but I mean that has been part of the discussion. And when we talk about this, it's not just in terms of the potency of the flower. You also need to think about the extracts. And so this is, I'm not sure how big this is here in Vancouver, but dabbing, I mean, you're seeing a lot of it we're hearing a lot about it in Colorado and California. And the idea here is you get some of these waxes that can be up to 75% THC, and you have your separate rig, doesn't have a bowl, has more like a nail than a titanium or glass. You get a couple of those creme brulee blow torches. You get that thing as hot as possible. You take a little bit of that THC wax, and then you essentially vaporize it and get a huge hit. Now, I mentioned this not to kind of create some type of scare, but the bottom line is we don't have much information about what share of people who are consuming cannabis products are dabbing. We also know very little about the health consequences. As I said, most of the research that's been done on the health benefits and the health costs of this are focused on people who are smoking lower potency marijuana. So as a jurisdiction, if you're risk averse, early on, you might say, you know what, we're going to put a limit on this. Maybe we won't allow the extracts. Maybe we'll limit flower X%. That's a potential option there. Because if you don't do that early on and the industry is created and you decide 5 years from now that you want to create those regulations or impose some type of threshold, that could be really difficult to do, especially if the industry is powerful. But of course, there are, like I said, there are dozens of other cannabinoids. There are other terpenes. There are other chemicals in the plant that we have a lot more to learn about. CBD has been receiving a lot of attention because it's believed to offset some of the effects of THC. And one of the things we found when we were analyzing seizure data in California is that as people were breeding the plant to produce more and more THC, they were actually breeding out some of the CBD. But at that time, there wasn't a lot of discussion about CBD, but then you began seeing Harlequin and some of these other strains beginning to pop up where people were focused on trying to increase the amount of CBD that was in some of the products or some of the strains that they were selling. And so one of the things, so not only do jurisdictions need to be thinking about, well, do we potentially want to limit THC? The other question is, do you potentially want to put a floor on CBD? And that is, begin thinking about a THC to CBD ratio. But I want to make it very clear, the evidence isn't here yet to do that. We don't know what the optimal ratio would be. But if you're regulating, that's what you want to begin thinking about. You want to begin thinking about whether or not to do this for THC now, and then also you need to be, down the line, you need to be thinking about this in terms of, I think that's where a lot of these policy discussions are going to be going, to THC to CBD ratios. And as I said, we're going to be learning more about the plant, so it might be the case that it's not just we shouldn't necessarily just be focusing on THC to CBD ratios. We should be looking at the interaction with other chemicals as well. So you have a lot of decisions to make if you're going to kind of go down this path. Related to that, the 8th P is purity. I mean, you need to give serious thoughts in terms of limits about mold and contaminants, and it sounds like Canada, through its medical program, has already done that quite a bit. A big question is you need to make decisions about additives and flavored products. I mean, it took us a really long time to be able to get flavored products out of tobacco. And at least in the States, we still have menthol. So that's another one of these issues. It might make more sense to potentially limit it early on, because if you decide not to limit it and 5-10 years later you think that that's the right thing to do, it could be a lot harder if the market's already used to these flavored products. The other big question when we're talking about potency is, are you going to allow marijuana products to be sold with, infused with alcohol, or are you going to be able to sell products that are, that include both marijuana and tobacco? Because that, in terms of the public health consequences about how this all plays out, it's not just how legalization influences youth, consumption of marijuana. You also need to pay really close attention to how marijuana legalization influences the use of alcohol, tobacco, and prescription opioids. So if you're being objective, you're going to focus on all of that. And even if you do legalize and you see an increase in youth cannabis consumption, an increase in the number of people experiencing these cannabis use disorders, that doesn't necessarily mean that that legalization is a net negative from a public health perspective, because you need to pay close attention to what happens to these other substances as well. And so the decisions you make about whether or not they can be sold, in the same product or in the same store could have big implications. So, because I had mentioned earlier, I wrote down a book with a couple of colleagues, and we did some back of the envelope calculations, just kind of showing that if you legalize marijuana, and even if it leads to a small uptick in teen cigarette smoking, the negative effects of that could overwhelm a lot of the potential benefits. So you want to be really careful about this in terms of making sure that it doesn't necessarily lead to an increase in tobacco smoking. And this, so this example of one of the vape pens will have a hash oil solution. Not only do you need to begin thinking about if you want to limit the potency of the hash oil in there, but what are the other chemicals that are in there? You need to decide, this is a discussion we're also having outside of the world of cannabis, also with e-cigarettes. You need to make decisions about whether or not you're going to allow it, and also what chemicals are going to be allowed. The 9th P is price. And this is arguably the most important, because for a lot of the outcomes that get debated when we talk about marijuana policy, a lot of those outcomes are influenced by price. What happens to the size of the illicit market, what happens to tax revenues, what happens to consumption, and therefore public health. This is all going to be shaped by price. And there is a small body of research showing that people are price sensitive. When the price goes down, consumption will go up. So as I said before, with legalization, we would expect it to push down those production and the distribution costs. But if you're a jurisdiction and you want to try to keep the prices up, you have a lot of options. Obviously, you could levy taxes, you could impose regulations, you could try to reduce competition. You can even require minimum pricing, which we've seen for tobacco. There's a lot of discussions about doing that for alcohol in terms of limiting, in terms of not letting the retail price go below a certain amount. So as a jurisdiction, if that's what you want to do, you've got a lot of options. But with respect to taxation, let me be very clear. Nobody knows the best way to do this. We're still learning. And one of the things you have to keep in mind is that if the taxes are too high, there's going to be evasion. And then another big issue you have to decide on is, are you going to apply taxes to the medical market? And so I've actually been spending a lot of time trying to think about all the different ways that you could tax cannabis and what are some of the pros and the cons of this. And I want to talk just about 3 of them. In the States, most of the discussion so far and what's been implemented in most places has been an ad valorem tax. That is, a tax as a function of the price. I think in Oregon, it's 17% plus whatever the local jurisdictions want at the retail level. In Washington State, it's about 37%. And so the advantage of that particular tax is it's easy to collect. It's easy to collect, and this is how we tax a lot of other products. There are a couple potential drawbacks. One, if you're not smart about bundling, there could potentially be some tax evasion with people saying, hey, I'll sell you this pipe for $40 and give you the weed for free. So you've got to be smart about that type of bundling. But the other thing you need to keep in mind is if you have an ad valorem tax, as those prices go down, so do your revenues per purchase. So that's why, especially you're now seeing, there are a lot of companies, a lot of consulting groups in this space that are trying to make projections about, hey, here's what total revenues for the businesses and also the governments are going to be in 2020, 2025. If you're trying to, if you're looking at that work, you need to pay close attention to what assumptions they're making about what's going to happen to prices. Because we would expect as more places do this, the prices are going to continue to go down. We're beginning to see that in Colorado and Washington, but you're definitely seeing there's a much larger decrease at the wholesale level than you're seeing at the retail level. But you're still starting to see a decrease, and especially once California becomes on board, and Nevada and other places, I think you're going to see those production distribution costs are just going to plummet. So another way of taxing cannabis is a function of weight. And in fact, this is what they do in Alaska. I think it's about $50 an ounce at the wholesale level. Advantage of that approach is that it's easy. Right? You can just do it at the wholesale level. It wouldn't take a lot of work. But a potential drawback is if you tax only as a function of weight, you create incentives for the producers to produce more potent marijuana and for people to purchase more potent marijuana. And as I said, there's a lot of potential uncertainty about whether or not that's good or bad, how that's going to play out for public health. And I want to say the other thing that we actually don't know a lot about, and when we're talking about high potency, is titration. That is, someone who used to smoke a whole joint that was 5% THC, if it's 15% THC, do they only smoke a third of it? This idea of titration, I think this is really important, and there just isn't a lot of research out there on this. So for students that are trying to, looking for research topics in this area, working with a faculty member to get some ideas or even qualitative work about titration could be really important here. Because it could be the case that maybe some people are using more potent stuff, but then at the end they're just, they're still getting the same level of intoxication that they were getting before. This is an important piece, and we just actually don't know a lot about that. The final way I want to talk about now, and if you guys want to talk about other types of taxation, I'd be more than happy to during the reception. But another way to tax is a function of THC. Tax is a function of intoxication. In fact, in the United States, this is what we do at the federal level for alcohol. The more alcohol content there is, the higher the tax. The advantage to this is potentially, if you're not going to limit THC, it gives the government an option to potentially nudge people toward, for risk-averse jurisdiction. It allows them to kind of nudge people towards some of these lower potency products. The drawback is really thinking about how to implement this. And the bottom line is, if you have a really good testing and labeling regime that you believe in and that you think is rigorous, THC taxes are easy. It's all based on what's on the label. But if you're in a place where you don't necessarily trust the labels and you worry about people gaming the system, and because for example, in some of the places in the States, people are allowed to choose which tester they go to. And we're analyzing these data in Washington State now, and we're watching some of these producers bounce between different testing groups. And part of this is just an issue with the federal prohibition. I've heard one state director of public health saying, look, we would like to create a state lab so the state could actually test the testers, but because of the federal prohibition, that makes it hard. That was the argument I'd heard. When I've talked to folks here, it sounds like with respect to medical, testing and labeling has already been done quite a while, and it sounds like people feel pretty good about the regime. If that's the case, then it would be a lot easier to implement one of these THC taxes. And as I said, and then finally, down the line, you might want to think about not only taxing in terms of THC, but potentially that THC to CBD ratio. The final P is permanency. No one has done this before in terms of removing the prohibition and creating these new markets. And so one could expect, and as I said, not only do people not know the best way to tax, we don't know the best way to regulate. So you can imagine that as they're going down this path, it would be smart to build in flexibility. Right? Because you're probably going to want to make changes over time as you learn from your own experiences, you learn from the experiences of other jurisdictions, as we get more science about the plant and the different cannabinoids. But if you're going to take that seriously, you need to build that in early. You need to build that into the law or the regulations that you're going to allow for this type of flexibility. Because if you don't, it can make it a heck of a lot harder to make changes down the line. And as I mentioned before, another approach is that you could do this incrementally, in terms of, let's be clear. Everyone talks about, let's do evidence-based policy. We don't have an evidence base for what's the optimal approach to supplying marijuana. We don't have that. And as I said before, there are pros and cons that we've thought about for all these different options. My guess is there are also going to be a lot of unintended consequences. But as I said, for some places that are risk averse, it might make sense for, some provinces or some states, maybe to start with one of these smaller options earlier. And then, another option is then to add in a sunset clause. Say, you know what? For the first 5 years, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a state monopoly, state stores at the end of 5 or at the end of 10 years. We'll then make a decision about whether or not we want to continue with that or try something else. Same thing with the nonprofit approach. Maybe start with a nonprofit, try that, and then you can potentially move on. Because if you decide to go from prohibition all the way to the for-profit commercial model, it's a lot. If you decide over time that you want to go back some, it's a lot harder to put that genie back in the bottle. But now I want to conclude by just talking a little bit about what we're learning, mostly from Colorado and Washington. And the takeaway here is it's still very early. Even though Washington and Colorado passed these initiatives in 2012, the stores in Washington didn't open up until July of 2014. In Colorado, they didn't open up until January of 2014. And so with data lags, it makes it kind of difficult to figure out, to really understand what's happening. Possession arrests are decreasing in Colorado, Oregon, and Washington. There was one disturbing fact that came out of Colorado, and I forget what the pre and the post period was, but they were kind of looking at marijuana arrest rates for youth, so those who are, I think, 10 to 17, and they were looking at it by race and ethnicity. And they found, I forget what the periods were, but they found that kind of over this pre to post period, the trend that you saw, I think it was about a 10% reduction in the marijuana offense rate for white youth. For Hispanic youth, it actually went up. It was about 20%. And for African American youth, it actually went up. It was more than 50%. Now, this actually got a lot of attention, but I haven't seen a lot of rigorous kind of empirical research trying to figure out what happened. Now, for example, I'd want to know, well, what was happening with alcohol offenses as well during that time? You'd also want to look at, you'd also want a comparison group. I've got some colleagues that are doing some similar work in Washington. It's not published yet, but they didn't necessarily see that. And I have no idea if that's continued in Colorado or not. But I think that was something that happened that really caught everyone who's participating in these discussions, really caught everyone off guard. Tax revenues are coming in. I mean, they haven't eliminated the illicit markets in any of these places, but it looks like, I think, for both Colorado and Washington, over the past fiscal year, they were bringing in about $150 million in tax revenue. The projections for California, once it gets up and running, and I'm not sure how long it's going to take before it's up and running, they're projecting that those revenues could be about $1 billion a year, which seems, given what we're seeing in other places and kind of what's the discussions they've been having about taxes, that seems plausible to me in the short run. I have no idea how this is going to play out in the long run. Because, if the federal government ended up legalizing, realize that you'd be able to concentrate production in a small number of places. A colleague of mine estimated that he was trying to figure out how much farmland would you need to produce all of the THC that's consumed in the United States? And I think his best estimate was somewhere around 20 mid-sized farms in Iowa. It does not take a lot of space. So once again, when you see people talking about here's what the market's going to look like in 2020, 2025, I think you want to ask some questions about, well, what assumptions are you making there? Because if that was the case, you can have a lot of large production concentrated in one place, and who knows what that's going to mean for tax revenue in some of these other places. Edibles have been posing a challenge, and so, in Colorado, they've been doing a lot of catching up in terms of creating new labels for packages, then deciding that the products themselves actually need to be labeled. But one of the interesting things, this is from some work that we're doing in Washington State. So as I said, we're analyzing all of the data that they've collected so far, and this is just looking at monthly revenues. So you can see here in September of 2016, in terms of, this is revenue, this is total sales, not revenue to the government. They're bringing in about $100 million a month in terms of the businesses. This is all at the retail level. That blue bar represents the sales attributable to flower. Most of that, so the majority of sales are still for flower, but even within that, the majority of those sales within flower are for products reported to be 20% THC or higher. So early on, you would see, the idea of the market, the 10 to 12% THC products, they're there. You're just not seeing that as much. It's at least 15. Most of what you're seeing is reported to be over 20%. But the green bars here represent the extracts for inhalation. This includes your waxes, your oils, the cartridges for the vape pens. And they seem to account for a larger share of the market than the edibles. I mean, you hear a lot about edibles because that's what Colorado is experiencing, but actually it's kind of interesting. In Washington State, after flower, it's the extracts are continuing to account for a larger share of the market. A lot of people want to know, well, what's happening with consumption? And so, as I said, there are a lot of data lags here. And so each year, our federal government, it surveys about 70,000 people as part of this national survey on drug use and health, with the idea of trying to get a nationally representative sample of the population. Includes a lot of questions about substance use, mental health. It wasn't early on, it wasn't designed to produce state-level estimates. But what they've been able to do is they've been able to set it up to where if you merge 2 years worth of data, so about 140, 150,000 people in the sample, you actually can create some state-level estimates. And so, as I said, there's a lag. So the most recent data at the state level for overall prevalence came out in December of 2016, and it was for the 2014 and 2015 period. So we really don't have much of a post period here. Remember, the stores didn't open up until 2014. But this is just looking at, for those who are age 12 and older, how many people, what share of that group, of that population, admitted to smoking marijuana or using cannabis products in the past month. And so you can see here, if nationally over this period, comparing 2011 and 12 to 2014, 2015, there's it went from somewhere around 7% to over 8%. So if you look at that in terms of percentage change, that was a 17% increase. Colorado, you had almost a 60% increase over that same period. What's really interesting, and that to me is not terribly surprising. What's most surprising to me is when we look at Washington. Their increase was actually below what we saw nationally. It only increased 10%. And at this point, I don't think anyone has a clue about why that's the case. So if there's students out there looking for research projects, this is I actually saw a poster about some of this. Hey, you might want to do. There's a lot more work to be done here trying to figure out what's happening. But you got to put this in perspective. This is only asking about whether or not someone had consumed marijuana in the past month. It's a prevalence measure. First thing to keep in mind is that there were 13 states that over this period saw increases of over 25%. So this is why a lot of people kind of use this to make allegations about legalization, but you got to be really careful. There were increases in a lot of places. Also, kind of from a health perspective, we care a lot more about quantities consumed, whether or not people are experiencing or meeting clinical criteria for cannabis use disorder, as opposed to whether or not someone just consumed in the past month. I mean, some of the better studies will actually get at frequency. So over the past month, how many days did you consume? But still, we want to know, given that you're consuming, how much are you consuming? Are you just having a puff at night, or are you consuming 2-3 grams? And our surveys right now don't do a good job. And I don't think they do much of this in Canada either, in terms of really trying to capture what's happening with quantities consumed. And this has to change. So as I said, we did that work for Washington State, trying to help them make projections. And so what we had to do is we had to use a lot of these other survey data, but then we actually did our own internet survey where we had pictures of unrolled joints and uncrushed buds next to a next to a coin and a credit card, and said, hey, look, here's a picture of a gram. On a typical day, do you consume about this much, half this amount, and randomly assigning the size of the joints. But there's a lot of work to be done in this space, but this is really important. Because the person, even if you look at frequency and someone's a daily consumer, you want to know, are they just having a couple tokes at night before they go to bed? Or are these people who are intoxicated for most of the day? That's going to matter a lot when we begin trying to think about, evaluating these changes. The other thing to keep in mind is these are self-report surveys. So it could be the case that part of the increase you're seeing is because people are just being more honest about their consumption. And so this is when I get on my soapbox about this, if we're going to spend, $50 million a year on a survey to ask people about their consumption, it seems like every couple of years we might want to also, validate that. And in fact, 15 years ago they did this where, they had some people take the, survey, then they had them submit to a drug test. Had no implications, but allowed us to get an idea about what share of people are lying. I think it's time we update that. That's going to be important. And I think that's going to be an issue here in Canada as well. But the other big thing to take away is these are almost only showing you trend data. This is not social science here. There are other things that could be influencing consumption besides policy. So the real rigorous analyses are going to, try to control for some of these other factors. They'll actually have control groups. And I gotta say, it's just gonna be a while for the most part before we get enough data to kind of do the analyses that we would like. That said, there's a new study that some of my colleagues did. It was published in February of this year. And it was from a different survey. It's a nationally representative survey of 8th graders, 10th graders, and 12th graders all throughout the country. And it's called Monitoring the Future. And they've been doing this survey, I think, since 1975. And what they did is they got all of the data from 2010 to 2015. And they created 2 different periods. It said the pre-legalization period is 2010 to 2012. The post-legalization period is 2013 to 2015. Even though the stores didn't open up until 2014, possession was legal. So one could argue that it could have influenced perceptions of harm and also and potentially I wouldn't necessarily say availability, but it could be for home production because home production was allowed in Colorado. But anyways, what they did is they ended up kind of doing some fancy statistical modeling to kind of come up with these prevalence estimates and making comparisons. But the takeaway from this paper is that after legalization in that post period, that marijuana prevalence went up for the 8th and the 10th graders in Washington state, but it didn't influence the use of the 12th graders in the state, and it had no effect in Colorado. Now, this is probably the first study that's actually, this is in Journal of American Medical Association, a very good journal. It's one of the first studies that's been done. It's been getting a lot of attention, depending on your preferences. Some people will focus on the Colorado findings, other people will focus on the Washington findings. But what doesn't get a lot of attention is the caveat they included at the end. Because that particular study only focused on about 30 schools and 6,000 students in Washington state. So they argued that, at the end, a greater number of schools would have been, advantageous, right? There are hundreds of schools in Washington state. Theirs was only based on a non-representative sample. But then they also say, and the sample design may lead to discrepancies between the monitoring future results and those found in other large-scale surveillance efforts. They make it very clear. The report came out, this was published in 2017. They pretty much had submitted this, early last year. As I said, I've got some colleagues that worked on this. Since they had submitted that, since it's been published, we actually have gotten more data from some of these different surveillance efforts. And so this is what I was just talking about. So this is looking at that from that study, when they're focusing just on the 10th graders in Washington. So the blue is the pre-period, the red is the post-period. And so this is what they report. These aren't the raw rates, they're adjusted to account for difference in demographics. But you see that between the pre and the post-period, there's an increase. And it's statistically significant. I think it's p-value of 0.02 or something. But this, as I said, this is a national study that samples schools from all over the country. They don't necessarily keep the same schools in. Schools usually only stay in for a couple of years. Then they pick other schools. And as I said, it's good for national data. But people have been using it for state-level analyses for quite some time. But what Washington State also does is they do their own survey of 6th graders, 8th graders, 10th graders, and 12th graders every couple of years. And there, the sample size for the 2016 data was about 230,000 students. So they're pretty much, it's only public schools, but still that accounts for most. But it's almost a near census of all of the students. So they do this, they ask a lot of the similar questions. And then from that 230,000, they essentially create what they would call a state representative sample. And so, as I said, the 2016 data just came out after this paper the paper came out in February, it was online, in December, and so all this came out after they published it. But sure enough, if we look at this Healthy Youth survey, you don't see an increase. Now, I want to be very clear, don't focus on the levels here, because I'd be kind of comparing apples with oranges. Just focus on the trends. In that paper, it saw an increase over that period. But if you're just looking at that sample from that kind of Healthy Youth survey, you actually see a decrease, which is kind of interesting. And then, as I said, in December of 2016, the new data came from that national survey where we were able to look at it by state. And if we just, we were only able to look at it for those who were aged 12 to 17. So it's a different group than 10th graders. But the bottom line here is you didn't see an increase. And so you got to be very, so I was talking about this earlier, this is kind of a Rorschach test for how, I kind of say it in terms of how people feel about legalization. Those that are against legalization will only talk about this result. Those that are for legalization will tend to focus on this and say, oh, actually it went down. I think if you're going to be objective about this, we really need to kind of figure out what's driving this. And there's a lot more work to be done. And so actually that's what I'm doing right now. And so I'm very fortunate. I've got colleagues that have worked on this. I've got colleagues that have worked on this. So we're all trying to work together because I really want to figure out what's happening. Because this is some of the first early evidence that's available about legalization where they actually attempt to make, have controls. It's not just trend data. And I think it has important implications, not only for kind of what's happening in the States, but for debates in other places. So this is what I'm going to be spending my next few months trying to figure out. I also want to talk a little bit about traffic safety because I know this comes up quite a bit in legalization debates. And the thing to keep in mind here is testing positive for THC is not the same as impairment. You know that THC and its metabolites can stay in the body for quite some time. But there are two studies that have gotten a lot of attention, both in Colorado and Washington, that have showed that the auto fatalities involving THC positive drivers doubled after legalization. That to me isn't terribly surprising. If consumption has gone up, that's not surprising to me that more people are testing positive for THC. But that does not mean that it was the marijuana use that actually caused them to get into the accidents. So if you're going to be objective about this, you actually want to focus on not the number of people that are testing positive for THC. You want to focus on how legalization influences total crashes and total accidents. Not only because of this THC issue, but remember what I was talking about earlier with respect to the use of other substances. We need to figure out how legalization of cannabis influences alcohol-impaired driving. I mean, the bottom line is the bulk of the research suggests that driving drunk is worse than driving stoned, but driving stoned is still worse than driving sober. But one of the big issues is when people are under the influence of both alcohol and cannabis. That, the bulk of the research suggests that that really can increase the risk. And we don't know how this is going to play out. So that's why if you're going to be objective about this, focus on total crashes, total fatalities. Don't just focus on those that are involved with THC. Concluding thoughts. I think as you engage in more debates about this, it's important to acknowledge these trade-offs. For some people, their main goal is they want to get rid of the illicit market. That's what they care most about. They want to, get rid of the criminal element there, and they want to bring in a lot of that revenue to, to the government. There are other people that care more about public health. And so it's kind of interesting. So if your goal was to try to shut down the illicit market as quickly as possible, what you would do is you would allow for a lot of production very early on, minimal regulation, trying to drive all the illicit growers and the illicit producers out. But on the other, there could be trade-offs there because if you don't have those regulations, that could have implications for public health. But so what I'm saying is you got to be, but other people would say, well, if you're going to impose some type of threshold on THC, if I can't buy weed that's more than 20% THC, I'm just going to go to the illicit market. So the thing you have to weigh is, well, is it worth it? Is it worth it to potentially limit the level of THC, even if there's still going to be a little bit of illicit, if there's still going to be a legal market? And this is where it comes down to the fact that reasonable people can disagree about what to do about marijuana policy. Because when you begin thinking about these trade-offs, so much comes down to your personal values and your preferences for risk. Folks that are, against the government telling them what they can put in their bodies, they're obviously going to, probably vote one way on this. There are other people that, that are morally opposed to intoxication, they're going to vote another way. For folks that care about public health, we really don't know how this is going to play out, and a lot's going to depend on the details. Just as an anecdote here, I mentioned I worked on a book with a few different co-authors. It was a frequently asked question book, 15 chapters. What is marijuana? What is THC? What's happening in the Netherlands? And so we worked on that, and we were all in agreement about kind of what the science says and what the science doesn't say. So we kind of worked on those 15 chapters together. We then decided, hey, let's add a 16th chapter where we each read a couple of pages about our opinions on this, based on what we know and how we feel about this. And we didn't plan it this way, but all four of us were all over the map. one person wanted to legalize commercial model, some person wanted to keep it prohibited, a couple folks were in the middle. But the bottom line is we all agreed on the same facts. But our personal values and our preferences for risk really shaped how we kind of came down on the issue. And so, as I said, if you're going to be considering alternatives to prohibition, there are a number of different issues that you're going to confront. But I think these 10 Ps that I talked about are at least a reasonable place to start. For those that are engaging debates, designing these policies, and also trying to analyze and evaluate them. So with that, I will close, and I look forward to your questions and comments. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I know there's going to be a lot of discussion. We'll follow the same format, and that is if you do have a question, please use the microphone that's on the side, and so we can record the questions, and of course we'll record the answers. If anybody wants to take a stab at it, please go ahead, and we'll let Dr. Kilmer answer the questions.
Thank you very much for all of that. I'd like to make a few comments. I think that if you look into it, prohibition is a public safety disaster. And I think that it was the DEA judge, Francis Young, who said that cannabis is the safest therapeutically active compound known to man. And you're comparing it in a lot of different cases with alcohol. And I think alcohol would be on the total other end of that spectrum. And with taxation, there needs to be reasons for taxation. Cannabis, in my opinion, will offset the use of opioids. It'll offset the use of alcohol, tobacco. It offsets violence. It is a definite benefit to people. I don't think it should be taxed. I think it should be subsidized. I'd just like your comments on that.
Yeah, so I reviewed the empirical evidence on the relationship between with some colleagues for this report we did for the state of Vermont, looking at whether or not alcohol and marijuana are economic substitutes, or people will you substitute one for the other, or are they economic complements? And keep in mind, this was work that was all done before legalization, but the empirical literature is pretty much down the middle. So in terms of, I can show you 8 studies that say they're substitutes. I can show you 8 studies that that say that they are complements. But the bottom line is, even if there was a consensus about that before legalization, it's not entirely clear to me that that's going to apply post-legalization. So much is going to depend on what happens with marketing, what happens, are you going to have co-location of sales? That could potentially influence the trajectory there. But you're right. I think in terms of when you're thinking about evaluating this from a health perspective, if you're going to be objective about it, you do want to pay attention to what not just what happens with respect to cannabis in terms of the risks and the benefits, but also what happens with alcohol, tobacco use, and also the prescription opioids. In fact, most of the economic literature suggests that tobacco and marijuana are actually economic complements. People are more likely to use them together. But that said, most of that research, not only was it done before legalization, it was done before you had vape pens in the market or e-cigarettes. So I think there's still a lot we have to know. And so as a researcher, that's what I'm going to be focusing on, as much as focusing on kind of what happens to consumption and quantities consumed and the products used. You want to pay really close attention to the consumption of these other products, and then the other behaviors, for example, impaired driving.
What about prohibition? How is there any justification for prohibition? And how is there any...
Well, that's a great question. I mean, some of it just comes down to people's values.
Criminal law for things that aren't criminal. It undermines our entire justice system.
I mean, that's your particular opinion. I mean, but not everyone has the same opinion about that. There are some people that are morally opposed to intoxication, so they're going to view it another way. So that's why as you engage in discussions about this, I think it's really important right off the bat. Let's talk about what what our values are about this and what we care about, and also acknowledging these trade-offs. If your goal is to eliminate the illicit market as quickly as possible, your policy prescriptions are probably going to be different from the risk-averse person who wants to do something other than prohibition, but is worried about the potential public health consequences. So I think acknowledging that, I think is going to be really important for having civil discussions about this.
So I just had a question about the taxation. So say if you take Washington, for example, they're making a lot of money off of the state taxation, but federally it's illegal to sell marijuana. So how does the federal taxation affect, or the state taxation affect the federal? Do they put money back to it federally? Are they still getting the same amount they were getting before and just having more as a state? How's that affecting?
I do think some of the businesses are paying federal taxes. And one of the issues is it's called Section 280E, which is part of the IRS code, which makes it, so essentially if you are selling a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 drugs, you're gonna be taxed on pretty much your total revenue. You're not gonna be able to have business deductions. And this is a big problem here. It's causing a lot of issues in the States because a lot of these businesses have to end up paying a lot more in terms of taxes. And so when I was talking about scheduling, and I kind of talked about the potential implications on commerce. Not only would rescheduling, it would have implications, I think, for what happens with research, but I believe it's only Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 that are where this 280E applies. So if it actually got moved down to 280, it moved down to Schedule 3 or was descheduled, I don't think that would apply. Cool. Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure it's Schedule 1, Schedule 2.
Most of the times when you talk about cannabis and policy and public safety, it's usually compared with alcohol and tobacco. Somehow I feel that wouldn't pharmaceuticals be a model as well it should be compared to? OTC versus prescription, especially if it's medical cannabis?
Oh, exactly. I mean, that's one of the frustrating things about living in California. When I tell people I live in California and we're talking about marijuana policy, they just kind of laugh because they know about our medical marijuana system, where you've got dispensaries all over the place. It's not regulated. It's very easy to get one of the recommendations. So a lot of what I try to do is try to help people understand that medical marijuana is very different in different places. For example, when I tell them about the Canadian model and that it's actually shipped to your house, people are really surprised. In the Netherlands, even though you've got the coffee shops all over the place, they actually have a medical system. It's pretty small. I mean, a couple years ago, there were only 1,000 people. There might be more in it now. But at the time, there's only one place in all of the Netherlands where they produced the cannabis, and there were only about 4 or 5. There might now be 4 or 5 strains. They produced it there. It got to the point where they had a very regular product. Then they packaged it, shipped it out for testing, and then that product ended up going to the pharmacies. So you would actually have to go to a pharmacy to get it. But no, you're exactly right, and I think a lot of the discussion, people, at least we hear a lot in the States, is let's regulate marijuana like alcohol. Well, it turns out we do a horrible job regulating alcohol. There's too much advertising. The lobbies have pushed down taxation so low. So it's interesting to me that people want to use that as a model because we don't do a very good job with it. So you're right. I think if you're going to have serious discussions about this, you need to start thinking about other models besides alcohol. Yeah.
Hi. Are there any models for testing road impairment? Or like anybody, because I've been eating cannabis for 4 years for cancer. And sometimes you can look at me in the sunlight and see the cannabis crystal come out of my skin, and I don't have any problems with driving whatsoever. And how is this going to be regulated for a testing model? What is impairment?
I think it's very difficult. You're right, because especially with some people, once you build up a tolerance. And this is why it's so difficult. I think there are a lot of technology companies and testing companies that are trying to figure this out.
What do they do in the Netherlands? Do they do anything? Is there any country
Well, if you go outside, in some places what they'll do, impairement's tough. Definitely you can hire drug recognition experts. You can train the police to potentially be able to try to identify whether or not someone's under the influence of alcohol or cannabis, but potentially other drugs. And other places, they'll do some of the sweat wipes or saliva tests, which doesn't necessarily get you impairment, though. That only gets you really recent consumption.
Yeah.
So no, you're right. So it's very difficult. And in some of the states, they've got zero tolerance policies. In Colorado and Washington, they've got this threshold 5 in the blood, 5 nanograms per milliliter of blood. And when California legalized, the folks that were writing it decided not to put that in. So my guess, like I said, I think there are a lot of technology companies that are trying to figure this out. You keep hearing people, there's discussions about a device out of Stanford focused on some type of breathalyzer for cannabis, We'll see. You're going to continue to hear a lot about all this, people with different ideas. I do think technologically it will be addressed in the future, but in the short run, it's going to be very difficult. And this is why it's such a contentious issue. And this is one of the big things that law enforcement is talking about. And they're right. Granted, as I said, driving drunk is definitely worse than driving stoned. But the bulk of the research suggests that for most people, that driving stoned can be worse than driving sober. Not for everyone, but especially if you worry about youth. And so I think it's going to be a tough issue that we're going to be grappling with.
This tolerance level,
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. This is a really tough issue.
Yeah. Okay.
I agree.
Dr. Kilmer will be around. If those of you that want to continue some of the discussion, we will certainly meet together in the poster session.
Yeah, hey, thank you very much for coming out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.